Many people believe that learning a new script is challenging, but mastering systems like Zhuyin, Bopomofo, or Japanese kana is surprisingly easy. With the right approach and resources, you can do it in just a few hours. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about Duin, which is a system for writing down the sounds of Mandarin. Unlike pinyin, Duin doesn't rely on the Latin alphabet, but instead uses 37 symbols to write all the initials and finals. Duin, or Bopomofo as it's also called colloquially, is mostly used in Taiwan, and in this episode we're going to talk about what Duin is, why you might want to learn it even if you don't live in Taiwan, and finally how you can learn Duin and other similar systems in just a few hours. Personally, I learned pinyin first here in Sweden, and then when I moved to Taiwan in 2008, I also learned Duin because it's practical to know when you live in Taiwan. But as we shall see, there are other reasons for learning it as well. Since then, I've also learned Japanese kana, which are similar in the sense that they also are derived from Chinese characters and represent spoken sounds without using the Latin alphabet. One thing that strikes me when discussing learning a new script, and this would include languages where you need to learn a new alphabet, is that people seem to think that this is very difficult, but in fact it's not. I think there are several reasons for this, and the first might be that people mix up learning the language with learning the alphabet or the script. For example, learning the Greek alphabet is very easy, but learning Greek is obviously not easy. Another reason is that people mix up learning the sounds and learning the symbols that we use to write down these sounds. So while I'm saying here that learning Duin or Japanese kana or the Greek alphabet is indeed quite easy, I'm not saying that learning to pronounce these languages accurately is easy. These are indeed two different things, which I've written about before and covered on the podcast, and I'll put a link in the show notes as usual. I think it's nice for a change to be able to talk about something in Chinese that is indeed much easier than most people think, rather than the other way around. So in this episode, I'm going to tell you how to learn Duin in just 2 hours, and you can then also use this method to learn Japanese kana, the Greek alphabet, or any other phonetic writing system you're interested in. Duin is still the focus of this episode though, so I think it's in place to say a few words about what Duin is before we talk about how to learn it. The full name in Chinese is Zhuyin Fuhao, or just Duin for short, which is what I will say in this episode. As mentioned earlier, it's often called Bopomofo or Bopomofo in colloquial speech, after the first 4 initials in this system, which are pronounced Bo, Po, Mo, and Fo. The Duin symbols are written vertically on the right of the Chinese characters. So why might it be useful to learn Duin then? Well, one obvious application is that it is the most dominant system in Taiwan that native speakers use when they write down the symbols, or that kids use when they learn how to pronounce characters in school. While it's true that pinyin is also used in many textbooks for foreigners in Taiwan, and that many language teachers know pinyin as well, ordinary people usually don't know pinyin, so if you want to discuss pronunciation or ask a question, you'd better learn Zhuyin. For example, in a conversation, it might be very valuable to be able to clarify if a word has the in or ing final, that's with n or ng, simply by signing the Zhuyin symbol. Likewise, if you ask ordinary Taiwanese people to write down the pinyin for a certain word or syllable, it's far from guaranteed that they will be able to do so. Learning Zhuyin can also be useful because it provides a different angle on pronunciation. I've talked about this many times on the podcast, and I'll put links in the show notes, but the sounds and the symbols that we use to write these sounds down are two different things. However, if you've only ever learned one system or one way of writing down a specific sound, such as pinyin, then learning a second one can help you break the illusion that the sounds and the symbols are indeed the same thing. Because now you have more than one symbol, one in pinyin and one in Zhuyin, that point to the same sound, so it becomes obvious that the sounds and the symbols are not the same things. Another advantage with studying Zhuyin is that there is no way you can cheat when using Zhuyin and just use the phonetic rules in your native language to sound them out. For example, when a beginner sees the letter J in pinyin, they might assume that this is pronounced the same way as J in English, which is not true. Thus, they might continue using this incorrect sound, and seeing the letter on the page might also block their perception of the actual sound, because you just assume that it's pronounced in a familiar way. When learning Chinese with Zhuyin, however, this is not possible, because there is no way you can guess how these symbols are pronounced if you haven't studied them. This makes it much more likely that you will pay attention and listen to how people say the sounds, and then link these sounds to the written symbols. Naturally, this also comes at a cost, because while pinyin might lead your pronunciation astray, it is certainly more practical to use, faster to type, and so on. This episode is not meant to be a discussion or comparison between different transcription systems, but I have published a series of articles about this already on Hacking Chinese, so check out the links in the show notes. I've been meaning to write this article for almost a decade, since I figured out how easy it was to learn Zhuyin compared to what people said to me before I did it. But the thing that pushed me to finally do so is that Skritter now has published a free Zhuyin course. As regular listeners will know, I also work for Skritter, but I didn't contribute much to this course, unlike the character course that I built a few years ago. Skritter's Zhuyin course consists of 5 videos, which will teach you all the symbols in Zhuyin, how they are used, how you can type Zhuyin, how it's used in Taiwan, and much more. This course is completely free, so it means you can access the full contents with a guest account. You do not need a paid subscription. The videos are also available for free, and I have embedded them in the written article on Hacking Chinese if you want to watch them. Or, of course, you can head over to Skritter and watch them there. If you do, please use the links that I provide. It will give you 10% off if you end up paying for Skritter later, and it also helps support Hacking Chinese. So how do you learn Zhuyin in 2 hours? The method consists of 3 steps, but depending on your situation, you might be able to skip or at least reduce one of these steps. First, study, understand, and learn the symbols, and this should take roughly 30 minutes. Second, commit what you've learned to memory using spaced repetition, which should take around 45 minutes. Obviously not in one session, but spread out over time. And third, use Zhuyin for reading and typing, which you can do for as long as you want, but I think 45 minutes is more than enough to cement the basics of the system. So let's have a look at each step in more detail. So the first step is to study and really understand the symbols used in Zhuyin. These symbols might look random or meaningless to you right now, so it's important that you ascribe meaning to them. This is very similar to learning the basic components of Chinese characters, which can also be regarded as a jumble of strokes, but then it's very hard to learn them. But if you look at them and see where they come from or ascribe some kind of meaning to them, it becomes much easier. And Zhuyin is no different. Before you dive in and study the individual symbols, though, it's worth paying attention to the structure of Zhuyin in general. There are 3 types of symbols representing initials, medials, and finals. And if you've studied pinyin, you should recognize these words, maybe with the exception of medial, but you can think of those as complex finals that have been split in 2. For example, in pinyin, we treat a syllable like xiang as having one initial and a final, and the final here is yang, but in Zhuyin, we would split this into a medial i and then a final ang, which then become yang when you put them together. As mentioned before, these syllables are then written on the right of the Chinese characters, and tones are indicated the same way as in pinyin, except for the first tone, which is indicated by not writing a tone mark at all. There are only 37 symbols in total, and the goal here is not to commit them to memory forever, but familiarize yourself with them and ascribe meaning to them, or make sense of them, in other words. I will not go through all the symbols here, that is what Skritter's Zhuyin course is for, but as you study the symbols, there are 2 methods that might come in handy. First, in many cases, it helps greatly to know where this symbol comes from. This is extremely helpful if you have learned some Chinese previously, because it means you have many of these symbols essentially for free. Just to mention a few examples here, the sound that's spelled with a B in pinyin, such as in bao, comes from the character bao, and you can see that it is indeed the top right part of this character, meaning to wrap. The symbol for the sound that's spelled with a D in pinyin, such as in dao, comes from that character, dao, knife. Finally, the sound that's spelled with an X in pinyin comes from the character xia, down. And if you check the relevant Zhuyin symbol, you can see that it looks like xia, except that the 3rd stroke has been removed. So it should be clear that if the origin of the Zhuyin symbol is as easy as these, it would be very, very easy to learn Zhuyin quickly. Unfortunately, this is not always the case, so you do need a second method when you run into other situations. For example, the Zhuyin symbol that represents the sound written with a J in pinyin comes from a character you probably don't know how it is pronounced, because it's not commonly used on its own. However, if you look at this symbol, you might realize that it is the right part of jiao to call someone, and so you can use this because it's also pronounced with a J at the beginning. There are also some Zhuyin symbols that come from characters that are no longer used at all. For example, the Zhuyin symbol that's written with an E in pinyin comes from a character that is no longer used and isn't very helpful. In these cases, I suggest you make something up that associates the shape of this symbol with something meaningful, preferably something related to the sound. For example, I remember this symbol by simply flipping the top part down, which makes it look almost like an E. When you encounter cases where the origin of the symbol is not useful, you can rely on this method and simply make something up or imagine something that is helpful. Another situation when this is necessary is the symbol that stands for the sound written with a C in pinyin. This symbol actually comes from the character qi, meaning 7, which is very misleading because qi is pronounced with a Q sound at the start, not a C. So here you can again make something up. For example, you might think of the horizontal stroke as the ground and the rest being grass with its roots. Grass in Mandarin is of course cao, and this is the right sound we're after here. So while this has nothing to do with the origin of the Zhuyin character, as long as it's helpful, I think that's quite enough. You can also use mnemonics or memory techniques to better memorize these characters, but I don't think that's strictly necessary. There are only 37 of them, and if you rely on step 2 and 3 of the method that we will talk about shortly, you don't actually need mnemonics here. Again, if you want a video lesson where somebody goes through all the 37 symbols with you, check out Skritter's Zhuyin course. So having gone through and studied these symbols doesn't mean that you have mastered them, of course. You haven't committed them to long-term memory. That, however, is not very difficult if you use spaced repetition software. These programs rely on two effects that are very well documented and very powerful. The first one is active recall, so rather than just seeing something and reviewing it that way, you're asked to recall it from memory actively. And second, the spacing effect, which means that if you review something spread out over time, that is many times more efficient compared to reviewing it en masse or lumped together. It doesn't really matter what program you use here, but if you check out Skritter's Zhuyin course, there are of course flashcards associated with it that you can study and learn the symbols. But you could equally well create these flashcards in some other program or find a deck somebody else has created. You could even use paper flashcards here. That is feasible for a limited project like this, and this is anyway a stepping stone to step 3 that we will talk about in a bit. It might sound very optimistic to be able to commit 37 symbols to memory in only 45 minutes, but that is actually quite generous. The point is that you're not looking at these symbols for a minute or so and then hoping to remember them later. Instead, you spread the reviews out over time, so you might spend only a few seconds per review, so in a minute you might be able to do 8 or 10 or 15 reviews. Furthermore, if you get something wrong, that will come up again very soon, whereas if you keep getting a specific symbol right, the program will notice this and schedule it out further into the future, so you can spend time on the symbols you tend to forget and not on those you consider quite easy. With this in mind, I can confidently say that most people can learn the 37 symbols of Zhuyin in 45 minutes using Skritter. That is not exceptional. This brings us to the third step. Use Zhuyin for reading and typing. If you have a very low bar for learning something, you could probably claim that you've learned Zhuyin after step 2 here, but I think we want to learn a little bit more. We also want to be able to use this for practical purposes, and then we also need to throw in some practice and fluency development. This will allow you to not just know the Zhuyin symbols, but also be comfortable with them. One of the best ways to achieve this, now that you know the basics, is to switch your phone's input method to Zhuyin. This means that anytime you want to type something in Chinese, it will have to go through Zhuyin, and you have to recall how these symbols map to sounds in Mandarin. This will be frustratingly slow at first, because you don't only need to recall the symbols, you also need to find them on the keyboard. However, the more you type, the quicker you will get, and the goal here might not be to match your speed using pinyin, but simply to familiarize yourself with the symbols, and you will be able to achieve that very quickly. Another thing I suggest that you do is read Zhuyin. You can do this by finding books using Zhuyin, or maybe using an online converter to take a text and convert it to Zhuyin and practice reading that way. While 45 minutes of typing and reading won't allow you to match people who have grown up with Zhuyin, it is certainly more than enough to say that you've learned the system. Naturally, practice makes perfect, and there is nothing stopping you from continuing using Zhuyin beyond this point. However, this is roughly as far as I think it's reasonable to get in 2 hours, and it will bring you most of the benefits with Zhuyin. If you want to learn more about Zhuyin, including all the symbols and how they are used in Taiwan, check out Skritter's Zhuyin course. If you don't want to do that, I've also included other resources you can use in the written article on Hacking Chinese, and if you try learning Zhuyin in 2 hours, please leave a comment and let me know how it went. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.